Someone crosses your boundary the third time this month. You feel the anger rising, the impulse to say something sharp, something that would make them think twice before disrespecting you again. But you don't. You smile, you let it slide, you tell yourself being the bigger person means swallowing the response, and you wonder why people keep treating you like you're optional. There's a part of you that you've been taught to suppress your entire life, a part that doesn't forgive easily, that doesn't accept disrespect, that's willing to cut people off without explanation when they've shown you who they are. You've been told this part of you is bad, toxic, something to overcome through personal growth and emotional maturity. But what if that part of you, the ruthless part, the part that can be cold when necessary, the part that prioritizes your own well-being over other people's comfort, isn't something to suppress? What if it's actually the source of the power you've been looking for, the missing piece that would finally make people take you seriously? We've been sold a story about kindness and compassion that sounds beautiful but leaves you powerless. Be understanding, be forgiving, always give people another chance, assume the best intentions, never be harsh or cold or cutting. Turn the other cheek, take the high road, kill them with kindness. And if you've been following that advice, you know exactly where it leads. People take advantage of your kindness. They interpret your compassion as weakness. They cross your boundaries repeatedly because there are no real consequences. You end up exhausted, resentful, and wondering why being a good person feels like such a losing strategy. Here's what nobody tells you. The version of kindness you've been taught is actually just people-pleasing disguised as virtue. Real kindness requires the capacity for ruthlessness. Real compassion requires the ability to be merciless when necessary. And the power you're missing comes from integrating the part of yourself you've been trained to reject. Your brain has a ruthless part. Neuroscience calls it the defensive aggression system. It's designed to protect your resources, enforce your boundaries, eliminate threats, and ensure your survival and maintain your position in social hierarchies. Every mammal has this system. It's not optional. It's not a character flaw. It's a fundamental part of how your nervous system keeps you alive and maintains your position in social hierarchies. But you've been taught to override this system, to suppress the natural aggression that arises when someone threatens your well-being, to feel ashamed of the impulse to be harsh or cutting or cold when the situation requires it. And that suppression is costing you everything: your boundaries, your self-respect, your ability to command respect from others. Think about the people in your life who have real power, who command respect without demanding it, who never seem to get walked over or taken advantage of. They're not nice all the time. They have an edge. There's something in their energy that says, "I'm kind until you cross me, and then I become someone you don't want to deal with." That edge is integrated ruthlessness. It's not that they're going around being cruel or aggressive. It's that they have access to those capacities when needed, and everyone can sense it. The kindness they show comes from a position of strength, not weakness, because underneath the kindness is the clear capacity to be ruthless if you push them too far.
Marcus was the nice guy for 35 years. He prided himself on being understanding, forgiving, never holding grudges, always giving people the benefit of the doubt. And for 35 years, people walked all over him, in relationships, at work, in friendships. He couldn't understand why being such a good person led to being treated so poorly. until he realized something that changed everything. His niceness wasn't coming from a place of strength. It was coming from fear of conflict, fear of being disliked, fear of being seen as the bad guy. He wasn't choosing kindness, he was avoiding the discomfort of being ruthless when ruthlessness was warranted, and people could sense that his boundaries were suggestions rather than requirements. This is the nice guy trap. When your kindness comes from inability to access ruthlessness, it reads as weakness. People don't respect boundaries enforced by someone who clearly won't follow through with consequences. Your compassion becomes exploitation-friendly because everyone knows you'll always forgive, always understand, give another chance. But here's what changes when you integrate your ruthless side. Your kindness becomes dangerous. Not in the sense that you're going to hurt people, but in the sense that it comes from someone who could hurt you if you crossed them, but is choosing not to. That choice, that active decision to be kind when you could just as easily be ruthless, is what creates respect. Sarah dealt with this in her career. She was collaborative, supportive, always willing to help, never pushing back against unreasonable requests. And she watched less qualified, less pleasant people get promoted while she stayed stuck. Her manager told her she needed more executive presence, which she didn't understand because she was doing everything right, being a team player, being supportive, being nice. What she was missing was edge. She needed to be able to say no without guilt, to push back against bad ideas without softening her disagreement, to let people experience the consequences of wasting her time. She needed to integrate the part of herself that could be cold, direct, and uncompromising when the situation required it. This is the professional power gap. In any competitive environment, pure niceness gets you exploited, not promoted. The people who rise aren't just nice, they're strategically ruthless. They know when to be collaborative and when to be competitive. They can be warm and supportive until you cross them, and then they become someone you don't want as an opponent. And the same dynamic plays out in relationships. The people who get treated with respect and consideration aren't the ones who are endlessly understanding and forgiving. They're the ones who have clear boundaries and the visible capacity to enforce them. They're kind, but there's an unspoken understanding. Cross certain lines, and this kindness disappears. Think about it in your own relationships. The people you respect most aren't pushovers. They're people you know have limits, who won't tolerate certain behaviors, who can cut you off if you violate their trust or disrespect them repeatedly. Their kindness feels valuable because it's not guaranteed. You have to earn it by treating them well. But your kindness, if you're like most people who struggle with this, feels cheap because everyone knows it's unconditional. They know you'll forgive them, understand their perspective, give them another chance. There's no incentive to treat you well because treating you poorly has no real consequences.
Jake learned this after his third failed relationship. Each one followed the same pattern. He was endlessly patient, understanding, accommodating. He forgave cheating, tolerated disrespect, and accepted treatment he knew was wrong because he didn't want to be the kind of person who gave up on someone or held grudges. And each woman eventually left him for someone who treated them worse but demanded more respect. Because here's the truth he had to face. His tolerance wasn't attractive. It was suffocating. It communicated that he didn't value himself enough to have real standards. The endless forgiveness didn't make him a good partner. It made him someone who would accept anything, which, paradoxically, made him someone not worth staying with. This is the respect paradox. The more willing you are to accept poor treatment, the less respect you receive. The more you tolerate, the less valuable your acceptance becomes. People need to know there are lines they can't cross, consequences they can't avoid, a version of you they don't want to encounter if they push too far. And accessing that version of yourself, the ruthless version, the unforgiving version, the version that can be cold and cutting when necessary, doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a whole person. Because suppressing half of your emotional range doesn't make you more evolved. It makes you incomplete and powerless. Your ruthlessness isn't something separate from your compassion. They're two sides of the same coin. Real compassion requires the ability to withhold compassion from people who abuse it. Real forgiveness requires the capacity to be unforgiving toward those who don't deserve it. Real kindness requires the option to be unkind when kindness becomes enabling. Elena spent years in therapy trying to become less angry, less reactive, less harsh. She'd been told her whole life she was too intense, too unforgiving, too quick to cut people off. So she worked on being softer, more understanding, more willing to let things go. And she became miserable, resentful, and surrounded by people who treated her terribly, until a different therapist asked her a question that shifted everything. What if your anger isn't the problem? What if the problem is that you've been taught to apologize for having boundaries? She realized her so-called intensity was just her nervous system trying to protect her from people who were violating her clearly stated limits. The ruthlessness she'd been taught to suppress was actually healthy self-protection. This is the suppression cost. When you suppress your capacity for ruthlessness, you don't become kinder. You become doormat disguised as compassionate. You don't become more forgiving. You become unable to hold people accountable. You don't become more understanding. You become someone who tolerates the intolerable and calls it personal growth. And the energy it takes to suppress your ruthlessness is enormous. You're fighting your own nervous system, overriding natural protective responses, forcing yourself to accept situations and people that every cell in your body is telling you to remove from your life. That internal war is exhausting, and it's why people pleasers are often the most anxious, depressed, and resentful people you'll meet. So, what does it actually look like to integrate your ruthlessness instead of suppressing it? It starts with giving yourself permission to have the thoughts you've been taught are bad. When someone crosses your boundary and you think, I could cut this person out of my life and never think about them again, don't immediately shame yourself for that thought. That's your protective system doing its job.
David practiced this by simply allowing himself to feel the full range of his anger when people disrespected him, without immediately jumping to understanding their perspective or making excuses for them. He let himself think the harsh thoughts, imagine the cutting responses, feel the impulse to be ruthless. He didn't always act on them, but he stopped suppressing them. And something shifted. Just having access to those responses, knowing he could be ruthless if he chose to be, changed how he showed up. His kindness became a choice rather than a compulsion. His patience came from a place of strength rather than fear. And people responded completely differently to him. Because here's what happens energetically when you integrate your ruthlessness. You stop giving off victim energy. People can sense when your niceness comes from strength versus when it comes from inability to do anything else. When you have the capacity to be ruthless but choose kindness, that kindness carries weight. When you can't access ruthlessness at all, your kindness reads as weakness. This doesn't mean becoming cruel or aggressive. It means having those capacities available when they're warranted. It means being able to say no without guilt, to cut people off without explanation when they've shown you who they are, to let people experience the natural consequences of how they treat you without rushing to rescue them from those consequences. Rachel tested this when her friend canceled plans last minute for the third time in a month. Her old pattern would have been to say, "No worries, we'll reschedule," to be understanding about how busy her friend was, to accommodate the flakiness indefinitely. Instead, she said, "I'm not interested in rescheduling. When you can actually commit to plans, let me know." And then she stopped reaching out. Her friend was shocked. She'd expected the usual understanding response. Instead, she encountered a version of Rachel she didn't know existed. Someone who had limits and would enforce them without guilt or explanation. Her friend tried to smooth things over, but Rachel held the boundary, and something interesting happened. The friend started treating her with more respect. This is the boundary enforcement effect. People don't respect boundaries backed by nothing but your hopeful expectation that they'll be decent. They respect boundaries backed by clear consequences and your obvious willingness to follow through. Your ruthlessness is what makes your boundaries real instead of suggestions. But there's a deeper layer to this. Integrating your ruthlessness isn't just about how others treat you. It's about how you treat yourself. When you suppress the ruthless part of yourself, you also suppress your ability to make hard decisions, to cut losses, to walk away from situations that aren't serving you, to prioritize your own well-being over other people's feelings. Michael stayed in a dead-end job for 7 years because he didn't want to disappoint his boss, didn't want to leave his team short-staffed, didn't want to be the kind of person who quit without having everything perfectly arranged for his replacement. His inability to be ruthless with his employer meant staying in a situation that was slowly destroying his mental health and career trajectory. When he finally quit, abruptly, without the long notice period he'd convinced himself was necessary, without making sure everything would be perfect after he left, he felt guilty for weeks. He'd violated his own image of himself as the understanding, considerate, never selfish person. But he also felt something else, powerful. He'd prioritized his own well-being over other people's convenience, and the world didn't end.
This is the self-protection permission that comes from integrating ruthlessness. You stop sacrificing yourself on the altar of other people's comfort. You stop staying in situations that hurt you because leaving would inconvenience others. You become willing to be the villain in someone else's story if being the hero in theirs means being the victim in your own. And here's what's wild. People actually respect you more when you operate this way. The martyrdom you thought was noble actually makes people uncomfortable and guilty around you. But someone who clearly values themselves, who will walk away from anything that doesn't serve them, who can be ruthless in their own interest, that person commands respect and attraction in a way the endless accommodator never will. So how do you actually integrate this part of yourself after years of suppressing it? You start small. The next time someone asks you for something you don't want to do, say no without explanation or justification. Feel the discomfort of not softening it. not making them feel better about your refusal, not apologizing for having boundaries. The next time someone crosses a line you've clearly communicated, don't give them another chance. Don't explain again. Don't try to make them understand. Just enforce the consequence you warned them about. Whether that's ending the conversation, canceling plans, or removing them from your life entirely. Be ruthless in protecting what you've said matters to you. The next time you feel the impulse to be harsh, cutting, or cold with someone who's violated your trust or disrespected you repeatedly, don't immediately suppress it. Let yourself feel it, think it, maybe even express it. See what happens when you stop performing unconditional kindness and start showing people the side of you that won't tolerate their behavior. You'll lose some people in this process. The ones who were benefiting from your inability to be ruthless will disappear when you stop allowing them to exploit your kindness. And that's how you know it's working. The people who stay are the ones who respected the ruthless version of you, who maybe even needed to see it to feel safe with your kindness. Because ultimately, integrated ruthlessness and genuine kindness aren't opposites, they're partners. Your kindness means something when people know you could be ruthless but are choosing not to be. Your compassion has value when people understand it's conditional on how they treat you. Your forgiveness matters when people know it's not guaranteed. The version of you that suppresses ruthlessness and tries to be endlessly understanding is actually the smaller version, not the more evolved one. The whole version of you includes both the capacity for warmth and the capacity for coldness, both the ability to connect and the ability to cut off, both the kindness and the ruthlessness. And when you stop seeing ruthlessness as something to overcome and start seeing it as something to integrate, when you give yourself permission to be cold when warmth is being abused, harsh when gentleness is being exploited, unforgiving when forgiveness is being taken for granted, that's when you finally access the power that's been missing from your life. Because the strength people have been telling you comes from rising above, from being the bigger person, from killing them with kindness. That's not where real power lives. Real power lives in the integration of all of you, including the parts you've been taught to hate. The ruthless part of you isn't the enemy of your kindness. It's the foundation that makes your kindness powerful instead of pathetic. So stop suppressing the part of you that could destroy someone who crosses you. Integrate it. Own it. Let people sense it underneath your warmth, because the most dangerous people aren't the ones who are always aggressive. They're the ones who are kind until you give them a reason not to be. And that capacity for ruthlessness, that willingness to be cold when necessary, that ability to cut people off without guilt, that's not the dark side you need to overcome. That's the power you've been suppressing, and it's time to let it out.